It's okay.
Ji, as you're all aware, IS 19 is a very important accounting standard. And it's more important because in Saudi Arabia, it was the introduction of the adoption of IS 19 was made mandatory to listed companies in Saudi Arabia with effect from 1st January 2016 and to non-listed companies in 2018. Uh, in Saudi Arabia, the employee benefits, the end of service benefits are also mandatory. So practically all companies registered in the kingdom are impacted by this standard. So before proceeding further, let's just have an overall understanding of the post-retirement benefits to which the standard applies. Post-retirement benefits are basically benefits payable to employees under a scheme set up by the employer on cessation of service in recognition of the service rendered by him to the entity. Post-retirement benefits are payable in accordance with the rules of the scheme, and the rules vary from employer to employer, and some schemes are voluntarily set up by the employer in addition to the mandatory schemes, if any. Post-employment benefits may take different forms. For example, pension schemes, lump sum benefit schemes, post-retirement medical benefit schemes, etc. We'll try and explain briefly each of these three schemes. Pension schemes are usually set up by the employer to provide a lifetime pension to the employees retiring from the employment after completing the eligibility conditions. The pension is usually paid for lifetime of the member, and on his death, reduced pension normally is payable to the spouse of the pension, and in some cases, minor children as well. The pension is also payable in case of the death of an employee while in service, and the surviving spouse is entitled to some pension. But as I said, it all depends on the rules of the scheme. And some schemes also provide for commutation of pension at the time of retirement at the option of the employee. Pension schemes offer different commutation percentages, ranging from 25% to 50% in some cases. If the member opts for the commutation, then obviously his pension, the remaining pension, will reduce accordingly. The lump sum benefit schemes are usually in the form of gratuity or end of service benefits, which are paid to the employee on cessation of his service, but they are paid as a lump sum, not a stream of pension. Apart from gratuity, the most well-known Provident Fund also provide lump sum benefits. Post-employment medical benefits also offered by some employers, and on retirement, an employee is entitled to reimbursement or of expenses for his medical conditions. And some schemes provide for inpatient, some schemes provide for inpatient as well as outpatient treatment, but they are usually subject to certain rupee limits or overall caps on the expense. Pensions, the employees' retirement benefit schemes can be broadly categorized into two sections. One is the defined benefit, and the other is defined contribution plans. Defined benefit plans, or the DB plans, as we all know, defined benefit payable on cessation of service. The contribution rate is not fixed, but the benefit is defined in the rules of the scheme. And the benefit usually is a function of the length of service, the final salary or the final average salary at the time of retirement, and the benefit factor, which is prescribed in the rules of the scheme. The entity sponsoring the benefit scheme is liable for payment of the benefit amount as per scheme rules, regardless of actual financial condition of the scheme. That's a liability upon the employer to pay according to the rules of the scheme. DB schemes are subject to different risks. They are exposed to the future salary increase risk. This is the main risk which belies the defined benefit schemes. Since the benefit is based on salary at the time of retirement, the employer is exposed to salary inflation risk. If the scheme is based on final salary, and if, for instance, an increase of 10% takes place in salaries, then the employer's cost for future salaries as well as past service liability will increase by 10% straight away, resulting in additional costs to fund the past service as well as future contributions. The other risk is the investment risk. If this is actually relevant only in funded schemes. If the funds of the scheme are invested, then the rate of return on the investments, if it falls below the expected rate, then there's a loss, and the loss has to be borne by the employer. On the other hand, if the investments perform better, then the cost of the employer is mitigated. Longevity risk, this applies to pension schemes only. Under a pension scheme, the pension is payable for life, and with the increasing improvement in the life expectancy, the cost of pension schemes is becoming higher, and the longevity risk is borne by the employer. This does not apply in the case of lump sum benefit schemes. The next is the measurement risk. Measurement risk arises out of the accounting standards. If in the future the accounting standards change, then entity's liability and cost recognition regime, the entity's cost may change. For example, prior to 2011, IAS 19 allowed the entities to amortize the actual gains and losses over the average future working lives, after allowing for 10% corridor, 10% of the higher of the liability and the fair value of assets. If the gains and losses were within 10%, then no additional cost was recognized. But this all changed after the 2011 amendments in the IAS 19, and the total expense, total cost has to be recognized in the balance sheet. Total liability, as you'll see in the later slides. On the other hand, defined contribution schemes basically define the contribution rate, and that is the end of the liability as far as the employer is concerned. The actual benefit amount is not the responsibility of the employer. The employer basically contributes a fixed rate, and the amount of contribution in respect of each employee is credited to his individual account in the fund. And at the end of the year, the interest income earned by the fund is allocated to individual accounts in proportion of the balance, usually. This sort of most popular plan in the DC is perhaps the Provident Fund, which is very common in subcontinent and the Southeast Asian regions. Provident Fund could be General Provident Fund, where only the employee contributes, or Contributory Provident Fund, where the employers also contribute, usually matching the contribution of the employee. The 401k plans in the US are also of the defined contribution type. We can have DC pension plans, which are now widely prevalent in Europe and North America, and also DC gratuity plans, which are not so common, but we can have a few examples of DC plans operating here. As far as the risks under a defined contribution scheme are concerned, future salary risk is transferred to the employee. Subject to the future cost to the employer is obviously affected if the salaries go up, but the past service liability remains intact. It doesn't have to be funded by the employer. This is the way the DC schemes are structured. Investment risk, since all the funds are invested and the investment income earned on the fund is allocated to the individual accounts, the investment risk is transferred to the employee. If the investments fare better, then he stands to gain, and vice versa. The longevity risk is also transferred to the employee because the lump sum is available at that time of retirement, and the way the pension is paid out of the retirement benefit lump sum is usually adoption of the employee. You can take an annuity, in which case the longevity risk will be transferred to the insurance company, but the insurance company will price the annuity cautiously and prudently, which will transfer the cost to the employee. As far as the measurement risk is concerned, there's no measurement risk involved. That's because the only amount to be recognized in the accounts of the company are the contributions which the employer is required to make. Because of these risk exposure regimes of the two schemes, the DC type and the DB type, a number of DB schemes are being converted into DC schemes. Most pension funds in Europe and US have been converted from DB to DC, and no new DB schemes are coming up. In Pakistan also, a number of schemes have been converted to DC, mostly the pension schemes. Underlying plan assets, these are the assets of the fund. It applies only for a funded scheme. And the DC plan, by definition, is fully funded because the individual accounts, the total of the individual accounts, the total balance in the fund has to be matched by the total assets covering the liability. It is usual to set up a trust fund for a DC plan as a separate entity. The trust funds are managed by the trustees, and the trustees are usually appointed by the employer. As far as DB plans are concerned, they can be fully funded or partially funded or even unfunded. In the case of a DC plan, a separate trust may be established for a DB plan as well. If the plan is partially funded, then under IAS 19, the deficit in the fund has to be recognized in the balance sheet. If the plan is unfunded, the entire liability has to be provided in the balance sheet. If a plan is fully or partially funded, the assets of the fund are invested by the trustees in approved securities. Usually it's the regulator approves certain securities for investment of retirement benefit funds. And the investment income earned is credited to the fund. Under a DC fund, the income, as I mentioned earlier, income credit is allocated to individual members' accounts. Whereas in the DB scheme, there is no individual account and the entire investment income is credited to the fund, which mitigates the cost to the employer. Now, IAS 19 requirements relating to accounting for post-employment benefits. IAS 19 prescribes the accounting and disclosures for employers for employee benefits. Employers are required to disclose certain numbers in their annual reports. The standard does not deal with reporting of employee benefit plans. So they are not required to do anything, but the entity sponsoring the plan has to disclose all the figures which we will discuss later. IAS 19 has a broad scope, including wages, vacation, holiday pay, non-monetary benefits, etc., as well as retirement benefits. It covers all types of employees, including full-time, part-time, temporary staff, and directors. Employee benefit categories there can be identified as short-term benefits, which are expected to be settled within a year. For example, the salary, wages, social security, paid annual leave, paid sick leave, bonuses, etc. And these don't require any actuarial working or valuation. Post-employment benefits such as pensions, lump sum payments, post-retirement medical schemes, all these require assessment of the determination of the liability using actuarial methods. Other long-term benefits like long-term compensated absences, sabbatical leave, jubilee, and other long-term benefits are also valued actuarially, although their treatment is relatively simpler, as we'll see later in the slides. Finally, it's the termination benefits. We'll discuss that later. Defined contribution scheme treatment in IS 19. Under a DC plan, the entity's liability is limited to payment of a fixed contribution as per the rules of the plan. It has no constructive obligation to pay any further contributions. Consequently, under a DC plan, the entity has to recognize contributions paid to the DC fund when an employee has rendered service in exchange of those contributions. So disclosures are limited here. DB scheme, treatment under IS 19. For DB plans, whether funded or unfunded, the standard requires the entity to account not only for the legal obligations, which are prescribed under the rules of the plan, but also for any constructive obligations that arise from entities' practices. For example, if there's a practice of giving pension increases regularly, then it becomes a constructive obligation. Although the rules don't require that every year the pension should be increased, but if it is the practice of the company to give cost of living increases, then it has to be valued in the liability. We have to make a provision in the liability for post-retirement pension increases. To determine the present value of defined benefit obligation and fair value of plan assets with sufficient regularity. These days, all audit firms are insisting on annual valuation of present value of defined benefit obligation and the fair value of plan assets. Although the standard does not require an annual valuation as such, the standard mandates use a projected unit credit actual cost method to measure the obligations and costs. The description of the projected unit credit or PUC actual cost method will be discussed later. The entity is required to attribute benefit to periods of service under the plan's benefit formula. Usually the benefit formula is a number of years times a certain benefit. In the case of end of service benefits in Saudi Arabia, the benefit is based on salary at the time of retirement as well as the period of service rendered by the employee for the entity. Now we discuss the methodology of PUC method. The projected unit credit method sees each period of service as giving rise to an additional unit of benefit entitlement and measures each unit separately to build up the final obligation. It is done on a year-to-year basis. Each year of service is 1 unit for the purpose of projected unit credit method. In determining the present value of its defined benefit obligation, which is DBO, and the related current service cost, and where applicable past service cost, an entity has to attribute benefit to periods of service under the plan's benefit formula. If we are talking of a gratuity scheme, 1 month's salary for each year of service, and at the time of valuation, a member has done, say, 10 years of service, and he retires after another 5 years of service, then for the purpose of determining DBO, we say that the 10 years is the defined benefit obligation. It should represent this 10 years of past service, and the future cost will be determined on a year-to-year basis. A further explanation of the PUC method, the projected unit credit method requires an entity to attribute benefit to the current period. Current period, that means the current year, in order to determine the current service cost, and prior periods for the past service in order to determine the present value of defined benefit obligations relating to past service. An entity attributes benefit to periods in which the obligation to provide post-employment benefit arises. Each year of service gives rise to an obligation on the part of the employer for employees' retirement benefit obligation. The obligation arises as employees render services in return for post-employment benefits that an entity expects to pay in future reporting periods. Actuarial techniques allow the entity to measure that obligation with sufficient reliability to justify the recognition of the liability. Under the PUC method, future expected cash flows in respect of each employee using the given assumptions are worked out. The future cash flows are projected, and the future cash flows are calculated on the basis of past service rendered up to the valuation date. And by applying the probabilities of death, retirement, withdrawal, etc., they are all factored into the projection of benefit cash flows. And these cash flows, the expected cash flows, which allow for probability of happening of an event, are then discounted to the valuation date using the discount rate assumed for the valuation. And this present value of defined benefit, this is called the present value of defined benefit obligation, which is basically present value of future cash flows relating to past service. Current service cost is the increase in the present value of defined benefit obligation resulting from employee service rendered in the current year. Every year, one more service year is added, and that gives rise to a current service cost. And next year, that present value of service cost gets embodied in the past service cost, and the next year's cost is again determined. So this is a year-to-year repeated calculation, which is to be reported every year. PUC method uses the actuarial techniques. Actuarial calculations are usually shrouded in mystery, but I just wanted to clarify that there's no such mystery involved. Actuarial calculations follow a logical path, and we'll try and explain the calculations in the following slides. For this purpose, we'll take a simplified example of a retirement benefit scheme, which is end of service benefit plan, a lump sum end of service plan. Benefit is payable on cessation of service, a lump sum benefit of 1 month's last drawn salary for each year of service, including fractions, no minimum eligibility period, and no maximum service cap, just to simplify the assumptions. The assumptions are salary increase rate R% per annum compound, discount rate I% per annum compound, rate of mortality at age X is denoted by QX, rate of withdrawal, resignation, retirement, termination by WX. We assume that the exits over the year are distributed uniformly, and also that salary increases take effect in the middle of the year. If you're valuing as at 31st December 2020, we assume that in this particular case, the salary increases will take place on the 1st of July 2021. To determine the defined benefit obligation in respect of an employee aged X having n years of past service and salary of S per month as at the valuation date, we will proceed in the following steps. The first step, if the employee leaves in the first year following the valuation date, his total service at the time of exit will be n plus half. Since his past service up to the valuation date, we have assumed will be n years, and he has completed another half year, so the total service at the time of exit is n plus half. Excuse me. Our assumption is that the annual salary increases take place with effect from the middle of the year. We've also assumed that the exits will be uniformly distributed over the period of 1 year. This means that half of the exits take place before the salary increase takes place, and the other half occur after the salary increases. On the average, we assume that means those exiting in the first half of the year will have no salary increases, and those leaving in the second half of the year following the valuation date, will get the full benefit of salary increases. Just to average things out, we have assumed that salary will increase at half the rate during the year. That will be an average of the two types of exits. On the average, we assume that salaries will increase by half the rate. In the current example, the employee's salary at the time of exit will be taken as S. S is the salary at the time of valuation. And 1 plus R is the increase to the power half, means half the increase rate. The salary will increase 2S times 1 plus R to the power half at the time of exit. The total benefit payable to him will be salary at the time of exit, that is S into 1 plus R to the power half times N plus half, which is the total service up to the retirement date or the exit date. But this benefit will be payable only if he dies during the year or ceases to be employed because of resignation, retirement, or termination. We'll have now to factor in the probabilities of death and withdrawal. The probability that he will die during the first year following the valuation date is, as we said before, QX. This is the standard notation for death mortality rates. And the probability that he'll cease to be employed in the first year following the valuation date on account of withdrawal, resignation, retirement, whatever, is WX. So the expected cash outflow in the first year following the valuation date will be salary times the length of service multiplied by the sum of the probabilities of death and withdrawal. The expected cash flow in step 1 is in respect of its total service. The past service portion of the cash flow will be N divided by N plus half. You see, total service up to the valuation date was N, and the service at the time of exit was N plus half. But we have to prorate this benefit to past service, related to past service, which means we have to multiply this expression by N over N plus half. So this is the cash flow in respect of past service in the first year. Now, this is the cash flow, but we have to discount it to the valuation date. And we do this by dividing the expression in the previous step by this 1 plus I, which is 1 plus I is the discount rate to the power half, because we are discounting it for half year. Step 4, if instead of the first year, the member leaves in the second year, then obviously at the time of his exit in the second year, his total service will be N plus 1 plus half, as opposed to N plus half in the first year. And the other factors accordingly are adjusted. The salary will have 1.5 years increase, and the liability and the probability of death will now be applicable to age X plus 1. Likewise, the withdrawal at X plus 1, and the discounting will be done for 1.5 years. Following similar logic, we define the present value of for the third year. It follows the same line of approach, and each year the factors are this N plus 1 in the second year, and plus 2 in the third year, and in the mth year it will be N plus M plus half, that we'll see later. Likewise, discounting is for 2.5 years. To sum up the discounted cash flows for all the years up to the member's retirement age, which we assume that will be 60 years, The total may be expressed as, you see, it's the same expression except that we have added the sigma here. Sigma indicates the summation. And the summation will be from m equal to 0. If you put m into 0, it will be the first year cash flow. M equal to 1, it will be the second year's cash flow, and so on. And we project these cash flows up to the members' retirement age of 60. And if we sum them up, so it will be a total discounted cash flow or defined benefit obligation in respect of one employee. Since the present value defined benefit obligation has to be worked out for all members covered under the plan, we add a second summation. The first summation was for one individual. The second summation is for all individuals, all members of the scheme. The first summation will be from m equal to 0 to 60 minus x plus 1. And the second summation will be over all the members covered under the scheme. You don't have to go into more detail on this, it's just to explain the concept behind the working of POC method. The formula described or developed in the previous slides were around a very simplified example, which assumed that a lump sum benefit of 1 month large drawn salary was paid on service, regardless of the reason for cessation. That is for retirement, resignation, death, etc. The same benefit was applicable. But in practice, there are many other complications which add on to this. There may be a minimum eligibility condition of different service requirements for, say, resignation, retirement, termination of contract, or death, and different benefit scales. For instance, the minimum qualifying service may be, say, 5 years on voluntary resignation and 3 years on normal retirement and termination, and no minimum in the event of death while in service. Further, the scale may be, say, 50% of last drawn salary up to 10 years of service, and 1 full month's last drawn salary if the employee has completed 10 or more years of service. So again, this expression looks a bit complicated, but what it basically does is it has we have factored in the terms FD. FD means the benefit payable, benefit scale for death in service. WR is for resignation. FWR is the function, the benefit scale applicable to withdrawals by resignation. And W capital R is for retirement, is the probability a person would retire on X plus M. And FWR is the scale applicable to retirement. Likewise, WT is for termination, and FWT is the function or the scale applicable to termination. Again, the first summation is for m equal to 0 to 60 minus x minus 1, and the second summation will be over all members covered under the scheme. This slide basically explains the terms which I've already described earlier. Now we come to the IS 19 requirements for post-retirement benefits. In the previous slides, we just worked out the example for determining the defined benefit obligation. Entity is required to give the financial statement of financial position. The financial position is basically the net benefit liability or asset, which is the present value of defined benefit obligation minus fair value of plan assets. If there are no plan assets or the scheme is unfunded, then the net defined benefit obligation is equal to the present value of DBO, which we worked earlier. And if there is a fair value plan assets, then the difference between the two, the present value of defined benefit obligation minus fair value of plan assets, is the net defined benefit liability or asset which has to be shown in the balance sheet. If assets exceed the liability, then there is a surplus or an asset, and then it will be adjusted for any asset ceiling. We'll not go into the details of asset ceiling, which is a minor point and relates mostly to funded schemes. If the plan is not funded, if there are no plan assets, then the entire present value, as I said earlier, will be recognized in the entity's balance sheet as net defined liability. An entity shall recognize the following components of defined benefit cost. So far we have been concentrating on the liability as at the valuation date, the defined benefit obligation, the present value of defined benefit obligation. Now we have to recognize the cost of the scheme. The cost of the scheme can be broken into different components. First is the service cost in the profit and loss account. That is, service cost is the cost which results from one additional year of service. And this is to be recognized in the profit and loss account of the entity. The net interest cost is also to be recognized in the profit and loss account. Net interest cost basically means the interest on the obligation less any interest received on the plan assets. If there are no plan assets, then the net interest cost is the total interest on the defined benefit obligation using the assumed discount rate. Remeasurement of net defined benefit liability or asset. In the case of post-employment benefits, remeasurements are recognized in other comprehensive income, OCI. In the case of other long-term benefits and determination benefits, remeasurements are recognized in the profit and loss. Now, an explanation of the current service cost. Current service cost is the increase in the present value of the defined benefit obligation resulting from employee service rendered in the current period. As we've seen in the PUC method, each period of service rendered gives rise to an obligation. So the current service cost is the increase in the present value, one additional year of service. Using the assumptions and notations used to describe the formula of present value of DBO in the previous slides, the total current service cost is worked out by the following formula. You don't have to go into the details of this formula. It's basically the same as the defined benefit valuation formula, except that service here is missing. That is, this is for 1 year of service. The formula is exactly the same, but you will see that n divided by n plus m plus half is not showing here. Here also the two summations.
If you allow me, it seems there is one question from Sania Javed.
Ji, please.
Sania, please open your mic and kindly say your question. Sania, you have raised your hand. Okay, please carry on.
Okay. We pass on to the next slide. The net interest cost. Net interest cost is the net interest on the defined benefit liability or asset and is determined by multiplying the net defined benefit liability or asset by the discount rate at the beginning of the year, taking into account any changes in the net defined benefit liability during the period as a result of contribution and benefit payments. In other words, the net interest cost represents the net effect of unwinding of the discounting of 1 year on the DBO. This is because we are 1 year closer to the retirement age, and the discounting period has to be reduced by 1. We have to unwind the discounting for 1 year on the DBO. Discounting period reduced by 1 year, and 1 year's investment income. If the plan is funded and some investment income is being received, then this mitigates the cost, the interest cost. The total interest cost is the interest on the DBO minus the investment income earned during the year at the assumed rate, that is the discount rate. but that applies only for funded schemes. Remeasurements are of different types. Actuarial gains and losses. Actuarial gains and losses result from increase or decrease in the present value of defined benefit obligation because of the changes in actuarial assumptions and experience adjustments, particularly high or low salary increases and change in discount rate. I'll go into more detail on this. When we do a valuation of benefit liability, we make certain assumptions about interest rate, about deaths, about retirement benefits, and all that. And most of all is the salary increase assumption. But when we come to the end of the year, we find that the salaries have in fact increased by more or less than the rate assumed in the valuation. If that happens, then the change in the liability as a result of this change in salary experience will be a part of the actual losses or gains, depending on whether the salary increases have been higher or lower than the assumed rate. Likewise, there may be a change in the assumptions. In the beginning of the year valuation, we assume, say, interest rate of 2% or 3%. And during the year, the interest rates have gone up or down, and we use a higher interest rate, say, of 4%, then the liability will be reduced because we are discounting at a higher rate. And this gives rise to an actuarial gain. So the actuarial gains and losses are of two types. One is the experience gains and losses, and the other is change in the assumptions. The change in assumptions could be financial assumptions or demographic assumptions. The difference between the interest income on plan assets and the return on plan assets. This is the other element of actual remeasurements. The interest income on plan assets is computed by multiplying the fair value of plan assets at the beginning of the year by the discount rate and taking into account subsequent changes of plan assets during the period as a result of contribution and benefit payments. And the interest, the assumed rate and the actual plan assets. If the actual plan assets, if the actual return on plan assets is higher than that assumed in the valuation, then there will be a gain, otherwise there will be a loss. So the total of A and B, the actual gains and losses on account of experience and assumption changes, and the difference between the actual interest income earned and that assumed, that estimated on the basis of a discount rate. That is a source of gain and loss. Now, the actual gains and losses are recognized in the OCI, as we discussed earlier. A brief method of calculating the remeasurements, we briefly discussed in the previous slides. The remeasurement gain loss on obligation is calculated as the present value of a defined benefit obligation end of the year. If we are doing the 31st December 2020 valuation, we'll work out the defined benefit obligation as at 31st December 2020, less present value of defined benefit obligation at the beginning of the year. Previously, as at 31st December 2019, we had already done a valuation of the same entity and worked out a present value of defined benefit obligation. So the present value as of end of the year, less present value of benefit obligation at the beginning of the year, less current service cost. Current service cost is determined in 1 year in advance. For instance, 31st December 2019 valuation must have worked out the current service cost for 2020. So present value of DBO end of the year, less present value of DBO at the beginning of the year, less service cost, current service cost, less net interest cost, which we've seen discussed before, plus the total benefits paid. The sum of these is actually the remeasurement gain or loss on obligation, not on assets. As far as assets are concerned, this applies only to funded schemes. So remeasurement, gain and loss and fair value of plan assets during the year is calculated in a similar fashion. Fair value of plan assets at the end of the year, less fair value of plan assets at the beginning of the year, less contribution paid during the year, less investment income earned during the year, plus total benefits from the fund, total benefits paid from the fund. So this, the total of this is the remeasurement of or gain or loss of plan assets. This also goes into the OCI. Total remeasurement gain and loss during the year to be recognized in OCI is calculated as remeasurement gain and loss on obligation plus remeasurement gain and loss on fair value of plan assets. Just repeating what we said in the previous slide. Curtailment is also an event which is discussed in IAS 19. A curtailment occurs when an entity significantly reduces the number of employees covered by the plan. It could be because of a branch of the entity is being shut down, or a plant is being closed, or operation of the plan, part of the plan is being terminated. The change in the present value of net defined benefit obligation due to curtailment is recognized immediately in the profit and loss account. It is not passed on to OCI, but it's taken into profit and loss. A settlement has a similar treatment. A settlement occurs when an entity enters into a transaction that eliminates or further legal constructive obligation for payment of certain defined benefits other than those prescribed in the rules. But if outside of the rules, the entity enters into an agreement with some or all of the employees and against payment of a certain amount to release the liability of the employer. If that happens, then any gain or loss on settlement is recognized immediately in the profit and loss account. Past service cost occurs only when there is a change in the plan rules. Past service cost is the change in the present value of DBO resulting from a plan amendment or curtailment. Past service cost shall be recognized immediately in the profit and loss account. If there is a change in the formula for pension for end of service benefit calculations during the year, then the additional cost or any saving has to be immediately recognized in profit and loss account. IAS 19 requirements relating to accounting for other long-term benefits. As we said earlier, it requires a simplified approach for other long-term benefits. Other long-term benefits include long-term compensated absences, such as long service or sabbatical leave, or jubilee or other long service benefits, or long-term disability benefits, or profit sharing and bonuses and deferred remuneration. All these are treated as long-term benefits under IAS 19. And their measurement is, the entire amount is recognized in the profit and loss account. The measurement of other long-term employee benefits is not usually subject to the same degree of uncertainty and measurements of post-employment benefits. For this reason, the standard requires a simplified accounting for other long-term benefits. You don't have to give all those disclosures. Every year, only a top-up amount is added to the liability. If you have a provision for compensated absences the beginning of the year, during the year, some movement is made in the provision, and at the end of the year, you work out the liability in respect of compensated absences, and the difference or the topping up amount is recognized in the is not recognized in the OCI, but recognized in the profit and loss account. IAS 19 requirements relating accounting for termination benefits. Well, termination benefits do not include employee benefits resulting from termination at the request of the employee. It's not termination in that sense. These are basically schemes like voluntary retirement scheme, where the employee opts for voluntary retirements and against payment of voluntary retirement benefit agreed with him, the liability in respect of the plan is liquidated. Accounting for terminal benefits is similar to other long-term benefits, and remeasurements are recognized in the profit and loss account immediately. Now we come to actuarial assumptions, which are key in the determination of defined benefit obligations, service costs, etc. IAS 19 actuarial valuations use various assumptions. According to the standards, the assumption should be unbiased and mutually compatible. By unbiased, it means they should not be imprudent, but at the same time not excessively conservative. It should be justifiable and compatible also. Compatible in the sense that when you're deciding on the discount rate and the salary increase rate, there should be compatibility between the two, although they are independent. Actuarial assumptions can be classified into economic, i.e. financial assumptions, and demographic assumptions. Economic assumptions are discount rate, salary increase rate, and the demographic assumptions are death in service mortality rates and withdrawal rates. Discount rate is used to discount post-employment benefit obligations, both funded and unfunded. A small change in discount rate will greatly affect the defined benefit obligation. Discount rate can be, according to the standard, discount rate should be determined by reference to market yields at the end of the reporting period on high quality corporate bonds. For currencies for which there is no deep market in such high quality corporate bonds, market yields, that is the yields at the end of the reporting period on the government bonds, shall be used. In determining the discount rate, the entity should estimate the average. This is very important. The entity should estimate the average future duration of the liabilities and then try and match the bond maturity period with the duration of the liabilities. If bonds with a sufficiently long maturity, normally the average future duration of liability is pretty long, depending on the age profile of the entity. But sometimes bonds with sufficiently long maturity are not available. Then the entity requires that estimates of longer term yields should be made by extrapolating the current market yields along the yield curve. The yield curve has to be used to extrapolate the longer term yields, bond yields. In KSA, there is no deep market in corporate bonds. IAS in such cases requires where there is no deep market in high quality corporate bonds, the market yields on government bonds should be used. For the purpose of determining an appropriate discount rate, we consider our firm uses this practice. For the purpose of determining an appropriate discount rate, we consider dollar-denominated KSA sovereign bonds traded in international market. This is the way we have determined the discount rate depending on the duration of the liabilities. We have created an internal linear model of the KSA government bonds and extrapolate or interpolate them to arrive at discount rates which are compatible with the duration of the bonds, which means that we have to extrapolate or interpolate depending on the length of the liabilities. Just to give you an example, the following table gives the discount rates for different liability durations that we use for the kingdom end of service benefit valuations as at 31st December 2020. Please note that discount rates change from year to year, in fact from quarter to quarter or even more frequently. These are the rates that we've used for 31st December 2020 valuations. If the average weighted average duration of liabilities is 3 years, the discount rate works out to 1.05. In 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, it gradually increases with the duration of liabilities. For 20-year duration, the rate applicable is 4.05. Future salary increases, as I said earlier, should be compatible with the discount rate assumption. This rate, the future salary increase rate, should be decided on the basis of recent history of salary increases in the entity. We should look at, say, last 5 years experience and see how much salaries were increased on the average each of the previous 5 years. The management's plan, this is important, what they are budgeting for in the next 2 to 3 years, and also the long-term view. Another important factor is the inflationary trend and forecasts, and other factors including economic outlook and future economic outlook. It is usually usual to keep the long-term salary increase rate, the long-term salary, not the short-term, not necessarily the short-term. The long-term salary increase rate will well within the 1 plus 1 minus 1% per annum of the discount rate, subject to be above. If we are assuming the discount rate to be 3% per annum, the salary increase rate should preferably be either 1% less, up to 1% less than 3%, or up to 1% more than the discount rate of 3%. That is either between 2 and 4%. Subject, of course, to management's plan for the next 2-3 years. It is possible that long-term rate may be, the salary increase rate may be 2.5% or even 3%, equal to discount rate. But the first 2 years, because of the economic situation, the company decides that no salary increase will be given in the first 2 to 3 years. In that case, we make adjustment in the salary increase rates for the first 2-3 years, and the overall impact is determined on the basis of the revised assumptions. Future pension increase rate is also an important assumption, but this is not applicable to the kingdom mostly, because we are mostly valuing end of service benefits, which are lump sum benefits, and pension increase rate applies only to pension schemes. This rate again is based on the recent history of the pension increases, which are constructive obligation for the working out of the retirement benefit liability. Management plans for the next 2-3 years, the inflationary trend and other factors. Here also it is usual to keep the long-term pension increases well within the inflation rate expected. Pension increase is an expensive addition to the total cost of the pension scheme. Increase in medical costs. When you're working out medical post-retirement medical schemes, we have to estimate the post-retirement medical costs, and they should be compatible with the discount rate. The rate of the actual costs depend on the last, will be based on the last, say, 5 years experience. What are the per capita cost of medical benefits and how it is increasing with inflation over the period of last 5 years, and how we look at the future escalation of costs in medical benefits. The medical inflation is different from the cost of living inflation. All these have to be taken into account, working out the assumptions for medical post-retirement medical schemes. Demographic assumptions comprise mortality rate of employee turnover, and claim rates under medical plans. As far as mortality rate is concerned, for end of service benefits of the type prevalent in the kingdom, mortality rate is not that material. Anyhow, we have to make some assumption about it, and our firm uses 75% of the rates based on the life table prepared by WHO for the kingdom, for the lives in the kingdom. The reason why we use 75% instead of 100% is because the life table is for the entire population in general. And the working class for which we are using this generally experience lighter mortality. That's why we're using 75% of the rates in the life table. Rates of employee turnover depend basically on the...
Justin, sorry for interruption.
GD, please.
What is the mortality rate percentage being used here as an average?
I can give you the figure. I don't have it right now in the slides, but they depend on the age. It's age-wise rate. I can forward it to you.
Okay.
I'll email it to you.
Okay, thank you.
Right. At the moment, mortality rates, generally speaking, at the age of say 35, it'll be 2.5 per thousand, and increasing with age. That's the kind of mortality rates that we use.
Okay.
Thank you. Rate of employee turnover, as I was saying, depends on the experience of the entity. The rates are based on the recent experience of the management assessment and what are their plans for the future, because the rates in the past may be lower, but the company may be, thinking of reducing the strength. So the withdrawal rates may be higher in future. So these factors have to be taken into account for working out the turnover rates. Claim rates under medical plans. This is again applicable only to medical post-retirement medical schemes. The rates are estimated on the basis of recent experience. Again, we have to base our assumptions mostly on recent experience and prospects for the future. When we carry out the valuation, we obviously need data from the company. Typically, the actuary would need the following data for the valuation of end of service benefits. The following particulars in respect of employees in service are name and/or employee number, date of birth, date of joining the company, monthly salary on which end of service benefits are calculated, nationality if benefits are different for Saudi nationals, location of the employee if benefits depend on location. The reason why we ask for the name and/or employee number is because every year we have to reconcile the data with the previous year's data, and that reconciliation can only be done if we have the employee number. Then of course, each company has its own retirement age, so that also has to be provided to the actuary. Date on which annual salary review takes place. In our simplified assumption, we assume that all salary increases take place in the middle of the year, that's 1st of July. But this is not necessarily the practice with each entity. Each entity has a different review date. So we need that date to work out the proper calculations. Average rate of salary increases given during each of the last 5 years, just to assess the movement of salary increases, and the average rate of employee attrition during each of the last 5 years. With reason, for instance, exit due to death or retirement or voluntary resignation or termination of contract. This will help us in formulating our own assumptions regarding future attrition. The following particulars in respect of employees who left the service during the year preceding the valuation date. It's not required for the first IAS 19 valuation, but for the subsequent valuations, we need the amounts paid out to outgoing employees, and employee-wise details are required to do the reconciliation. Provision of end of service benefits in the books of the company at the end of the preceding year, movements therein during the year preceding the valuation date, and the balance of the as of the valuation date. If a valuation has been carried out in the previous year, we would prefer to have a valuation report before us so that we can do this movement analysis. And the rules on the end of service benefits, that's important, because without the rules in detail, we cannot work out future costs and liabilities. Now the IAS 19 disclosures. IAS 19 gives an elaborate regime of disclosures for defined benefit plans. First of all, the entity should disclose the significant actuarial assumptions, including discount rate, salary increase assumption, pension increase assumption, not relevant for lump sum benefit schemes, mortality table or rates used, withdrawal assumption, and any other miscellaneous assumptions made. So all these assumptions have to be listed. The entity should also disclose information that explains the characteristics of the defined benefit plan and risks associated with it. This is a requirement. The entity should give a brief description of the various risks associated and how they are being mitigated. It identifies and explains the amount of financial statements arising from different benefit plans. These explanations have all to be also to be given. It describes how its defined benefit plan may affect the amount, timing, and uncertainty of the future entity's cash flow. This entails a projection of cash flows for the next 10-15 years. And this is part of the disclosure. We'll give more details in the subsequent slides. The entity shall describe the characteristics of the end of service benefits, including benefit scale, eligibility conditions. The entity is exposed to the following risks. The entity is, of course, to the mortality risk. Mortality risk is not that material, as I said earlier, but it has to be described. Investment risk, this applies only to funded schemes, not to unfunded schemes. Final salary risk, yes, that is an important risk for defined benefit schemes. The risks that final salary at the time of cessation of service would be higher than what was assumed. Since the benefit is calculated on final salary, the benefit amount increases in line with salary. Withdrawal risk, again, may be higher or lower withdrawal experience. The risk of higher or lower withdrawal experience than assumed. The impact may be either way. The final effect could go either way depending on the beneficiary's service age and age profile and plan rules. These are the different disclosures that are required. First of all is the statement of financial position, which we had discussed in previous slides. Present value of defined benefit obligation. This has to be stated as of the valuation date. And if the plan is funded, then fair value of plan assets also required. Or if the plan is not funded, then this is zero. And there will be a deficit of 1 plus 2, which is equal to the total present value of defined benefit obligation for an unfunded plan. Movement in the net defined benefit liability or assets. Balance sheet, prepaid, accrued as at the beginning of the period. The net liability which was recognized in the beginning of the period. Net periodic pension benefit cost, the service cost or interest cost. That is to be added to it. Actual contributions made by the employer. It applies only to funded schemes. Benefit paid out by the employer is a negative item. Total amount of remeasurements recognized in the OCI, which we worked earlier, and the balance sheet prepaid of the net liability, defined benefit liability position at the end of the year. This is basically a reconciliation from the beginning to end of the period. Cost to be recognized in P&L for the year. Service cost. First of all, the current service cost is worked out based on the formulas we described earlier. Past service cost, if any, and the total service cost is the sum of these two items. Net interest cost is the interest cost on defined benefit obligation. Interest income on plan assets, if it's a funded scheme, is a negative item. Net interest cost is 1 minus 2, or if there is no plan asset, or if this plan is unfunded, then net interest cost will be the interest cost on defined benefit obligation. that is a defined benefit obligation, average over the year times the discount rate. Remeasurements recognized in the OCI during the year, actual gains and losses on obligation, plus actual gains, losses on plan assets for funded schemes only. The total remeasurement cost is the total of the two items. The total defined benefit cost recognized in the P&L plus OCI is 3 plus 6. The cost in the P&L plus cost in the recognized in the OCI. Movement in the present value of defined benefit obligation. Present value of defined benefit obligation beginning of the year plus service cost plus interest cost minus benefits paid to outgoing members plus or minus remeasurements, gains or losses on obligation, and the present value of defined benefit obligation end of the year. This again is a reconciliation from the beginning of the year to the end of the year for defined benefit obligation. A similar reconciliation is for plan assets for funded schemes, fair value of plan assets beginning of the year, interest income on plan assets, actual contribution by the employer to the fund, minus actual benefits paid out from the fund during the period, plus or minus actual gains or losses on plan assets. We are at the end of the year, the total fair value of plan assets is determined, which reconciles the beginning of the year figure. The IAS also requires that the present value of defined benefit obligation be separated into vested benefits and non-vested benefits. Vested benefits are in respect of those employees who have already fulfilled the eligibility conditions. And non-vested benefits are in respect of those who are not entitled to any benefit if they leave immediately. The total obviously is the total defined benefit obligation, present value of defined benefit obligation. Types of benefits earned to date. Accumulated benefit obligation is the same as projected benefit obligation, the liability, but without considering any future salary increases. If we assume that the future salary increases will be zero, then the accumulated benefit obligation or the ABO is equal to the PBO less the salary increases. And the component of salary increases is given as a separate item. So the total is the type of benefits equal to the benefit obligation. Disaggregation of fair value of plan assets applies only to funded schemes. It just gives a separate item-wise detail of the investments held by the fund, cash or cash equivalent, equity instruments, investment in mutual funds, debt instruments, etc. And the total should tie up with the total fair value of plan assets. Remeasurement of recognized other comprehensive income, gain loss due to change in financial assumptions, gain loss during change of demographic assumptions, gain loss due to experience adjustments, and total actual gain loss on obligation is the sum of all these items. Likewise, for funded plans, we have to work out a similar calculation for plan assets, actual return on plan assets, plus interest income, any opening difference, and the total actual gain loss on plan assets. The total remeasurements recognized in OCI during the year will be the sum of the two items. Maturity profile of the defined benefit obligation. The weighted average duration of the PBO has to be disclosed. It's a separate calculation which actuaries work out. The weighted average duration of the PBO. The distribution of timing of benefits. We have to project the cash flows in the first year, in the second year, third year, and so on. And 6 to 10 can be clubbed together. This is basically the projected cash flows based on past service up to the valuation date. The IAS also requires a sensitivity analysis on significant actual assumptions. This is an important addition to the disclosures, and it is good for the management understanding as well. discount rate, whatever we have assumed, add 0.5% to it and work out the liability. And again, discount rate, what we have assumed, less 5%. The lower the discount rate, the higher the liability. So the change in the actual assumptions related to discount rate will show the impact on the projected benefit obligation. Likewise, salary increase assumption is also very important in the determination of liability. In fact, the present value of defined benefit obligation is very sensitive to these two items, discount rate and salary increase rate. And sensitivity rightly shows the impact of the two. P&L cost for the following year. When we do the valuation of end of service benefit at the end of the year, say 31st December 2020, we have to work out the cost for the following year. The service cost, which is current service cost, past service cost, and the total service cost. That is something which we have to project, and that becomes part of the future cost to be recognized in the P&L. Net interest cost is cost on the defined benefit, interest cost on the defined benefit obligation, less income on plan assets, if any. So the service cost plus interest cost has to be recognized in the following year's P&L. This is a hardwired figure which does not change. And the next year when we do the valuation, we'll recognize the same service cost and same interest cost, but the only change would be gains and losses, if any. End of service, just since we are working for the Saudi law here, the next slide gives a brief description of the benefits under the end of service requirements of the Saudi labor law. Service less than 2 years, no benefit. 2 to 5 years, 1/6 of the monthly salary. 5 to 10, 1/3 for the first 5 years, and 2/3 monthly salary for each year in excess of 5 years. And greater than 10 years, half monthly salary for the first 5 years of service, plus 1 month salary for the service in excess of 5 years. In case of death or normal retirement or termination of contract with the company, up to 5 years, half month salary for the first 5 years of service. Greater than 5 years, the total service is more than 5 years, half monthly salary for the first 5 years, plus 1 month salary for the service in excess of 5 years. This is a brief description of the actual valuation process. The first step is would be to send to the client the data requirements. Actually, we'll send the data requirements, including details of the plan rules and other information regarding recent salary increases, which we've all discussed earlier. And if there's any points to be clarified by the client, they can do that. We obtain the client data from the client in the prescribed format, analyze the data, and perform various validity checks, including reconciliation with the previous year's data, if available. This is a vital step in the whole process, because if reconciliation is not properly done, the results cannot be very comparable. Obtain clarification on any points with the client, if necessary. Based on the data, propose a discount rate and future salary increase rate and employee turnover assumptions for the valuation. This actually proposes this and discusses with the client. Once the assumptions are agreed with the client, feed the data information in the actual valuation model tailored for the specific plan features. And share with the client the liability and cost figures and other disclosures produced by the model. Once the disclosures are agreed, and then submit a draft report for the discussion with the client. And after that, submit the final signed formal report to the client. This ends my presentation. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them.
Shuja sir, बहुत शुक्रिया for your presentation. I have a small question. Due to pandemic,
जी,
too many people lost the jobs in 2019, in 2020. And same situation seems if the COVID goes, again, too many terminations will be in 2021.
correct.
So in this case, the attrition rate will vary too much.
Very correct. Very
So
right.
how to make best estimates for this?
I think we have to discuss this with the company. What are their expectations of future attrition rates? And the general practice also, because quite a few, you're absolutely right, many companies have, reduced their strength because of COVID. And though it is a temporary phase, hopefully, but it has to be built into the valuation, at least for the first 2-3 years, we should embody this or incorporate or factor in this revised attrition rates.
Okay. Gentlemen, any other questions?
Yes, there is a question amongst the participants that I'll first of all, thank you very much, Mr. Shujat, for this very, very informative and very educative session, I would say. One of our participants, Mr. Usama Gulzar, has posted a question that would you please, I read his question. Would you please let me know how would you find average life expectancy of a retired person?
Yes, that's a very good question. The life expectancy of retired employees is based on life tables prepared for this purpose. When we are talking about advanced countries like UK, US, and Europe, they have separate mortality tables for pensioners and separate mortality table for insured population and for general population as well. For retired employees or retired pensioners, the life expectancy is assumed to improve every year. So an improvement factor is built into the graduation of the life tables which are prepared. And there is a Institute of Actuaries UK has a continuous mortality investigation team which constantly studies the improvement of life expectancy, and life expectancy in Pakistan and in other Saudi Arabia and the region, that has improved tremendously during the past few years because of the improvement in the medical facilities. So we have to rely on the life tables, and which are applicable to the particular sect or cohort that we are talking about.
I hope the question is answered for Mr. Usama. Thank you very much for your brief and very explanatory answer. Yes, over to Asif sir.
Thank you, Faiz sir. And once again, I'm thankful to all the participants and Mr. Shujat for your time with the valuable presentation. We will request you to please share your presentation. So we will circulate to the members. So if they have any question, anything to be asked, they can contact you.
We'll do that. We'll certainly do that.
And we also appreciate the support from the corporate office from Karachi in arranging this seminar. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you very much, Shujat sir. So kind of you. Thank you for your time and this valuable addition. We look forward for hosting more sessions from your good self in future as well. So on behalf of KSA Branch Council, CPD Committee and ICMA Pakistan, we thank you very much for allocating us your valuable time and look forward to have future sessions as well. Thank you very much.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Jazakallah khair. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam.